Being thrown into the Colosseum and left to fight to the death against lions? Well, that's terrifying, but it wasn't even close to being the worst way to die in ancient Rome. If you really wanted to experience exquisite suffering, you had to be taken away from the crowds, stripped naked and tied up on a wheel. We're talking about the Wheel of Pain, one of the most cruel and excruciating ways to die in the Roman Empire. It was an invention of the Roman dictator Gaius Julius Caesar, a man known for his ruthlessness and bloodlust. His assassination in 44 BC didn't stop the practice either. The Wheel of Pain continued to be used for centuries after that to punish people who committed high treason or other serious crimes such as theft or rebellion. It was also sometimes used just to scare people who had done nothing at all. Just imagine being minding your own business in ancient Rome one day when suddenly you rearrested by military police, dragged through the streets and tied onto a wheel just because you insulted the emperor. Well, don't, because we're about to tell you all the gory details of this awful fate. So what exactly was the Wheel of Pain? Why did they use it? And how did they make it? This is the Wheel of Pain, a torture device and weapon used throughout the Roman Empire. It was especially favored by the military commanders and consisted of a large wooden wheel upon which victims were strapped. Their hands were tied behind their back, at the top of the wheel, with their legs tied together at the bottom. Thus, the wheel forced the victim's arms to be spread wide with their elbows pulled out of their sockets and their legs spread apart with their knees dislocated. The executioner could then rotate the wheel, forcing the victim's body to be twisted around and around, breaking bones, dislocating joints, and tearing muscles. Sometimes the wheel was even lifted in the air so that the victim's body bent unnaturally. One historian wrote that the victim's torso could be raised above their head or lowered below their knees, making their backbone bend like a bow. To ensure a slow death, the executioner might also cut tendons, or even remove the knee. The Romans were quite inventive when it came to causing pain. The exact origins of the wheel are unknown, but it appears to have been invented sometime during the late Republic. It first appeared in written records in 68 BC during the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. According to Plutarch's biography of Caesar, several Pompeian supporters were tortured on the wheel after being captured in the siege of a city in Asia Minor. Later, the Roman dictator used it to intimidate those who opposed him. A good example of this is Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar's adopted son. Once he publicly criticized his father for mismanaging the Gallic treasury, Caesar retaliated by putting Brutus' wife on the wheel. She died as a result. There was another time when Caesar tied the senators to chariots like horses and whipped them as they pulled him around. He also chained two of them to chariots and made them race each other while pulling. At times he would even strap women to chariots and have them pull him around. So it is not hard to believe that the idea of strapping people to wheels evolved into something more grotesque. In fact, the brutal treatment of prisoners and enemies on wheels was a common practice among many armies throughout history, including the Persians, Greeks, and Carthage. The wheel became an extremely popular method of capital punishment in the Roman world. Under the Empire, emperors like Nero and Caligula used it frequently. After the Emperor Nero's death in 68 AD, the empire fell into chaos, erupting in civil wars. The year 69 AD was later called the Year of the Four Emperors, though there were actually 5 emperors that year. During this turmoil, there were executions galore. People were killed by swords, poison, crucifixion, fire, and of course, the wheel. During the reign of Emperor Vespasian, the cruelty reached new heights. He had the infamous Domitian as his heir, who took sadism to a whole new level. The future emperor watched with amusement as 4 men were put to death by means of the wheel in the Circus Maximus, according to the historians. What was interesting, however, was the reason for their deaths. They had been charged with nothing less than throwing poisonous mushrooms into the emperor's stew. While that was undoubtedly an attempt to assassinate the emperor, it wasn't the kind of crime for which the wheel was usually employed. As far as we know, Domitian was the first emperor to use the wheel as a tool of terror, spreading fear throughout his empire by having people killed in this horrible manner, just as Caesar had done before him. He tied people to wheels not just in Rome, but throughout the empire. The only goal? To strike fear into the hearts of potential enemies. An inscription found in the Greek city of Philippi describes one such case. It reads, "This wheel was set up here by order of the most divine Domitian, the emperor, to terrify traitors." A similar wheel of pain can be seen in a fresco from Pompeii. Also, a marble fragment from Antioch shows a condemned man about to be executed on a wheel. In the absence of written evidence, scholars have often relied on these works of art to piece together what life was like under Domitian. However, researchers are still unsure whether the wheel was positioned vertically or horizontally in this fresco. Was it intended to break the man's limbs or simply terrify onlookers? We may never know. The Wheel of Pain reached its peak of popularity under Domitian's successor, the infamous Emperor Commodus, whose excesses and madness are well known. From the movie Gladiator, starring Russell Crowe, You probably remember the part where the emperor ordered the protagonist to be thrown into the chariot like a horse and flogged as he pulled the carriage. That scene was inspired by real events. In a letter to his friend Pliny the Younger, the Roman statesman and philosopher describes how Commodus amused himself by whipping chariots like horses, including the imperial quadriga. Charioteers and horses alike were said to be flogged. Even the charioteer of the quadriga, because it's an imperial chariot, should be considered very lucky if he survived the training. You can imagine that driving the emperor's chariot was stressful enough without having to worry about being beaten to death. But Commodus was like Caesar and Nero before him, preferring to kill people with the wheel instead of riding it. Commodus likely got the idea from the gladiator games. Like in the movies, gladiators sometimes fought to the death on chariots, competing in races while wielding swords. So it was one of that biggest step to go from fighting against each other to fighting against the emperor. We have textual evidence for this gruesome practice from the writings of Cassius Dio. He wrote Commodus chained chariots to chariots men, to chariots, beasts, to chariots and women, to chariots and compelled them to race, flogging them, sometimes letting them loose that he might see which would get the start of the others. Cassius Dio goes on to say that Commodus delighted in killing people, both good and bad, with the wheel. For instance, he executed 6 of his own courtiers, for no other reason than that he disliked their clothes. He also sentenced philosophers to death for criticizing his mother, Faustina the Younger. According to Cassius Dio, he had many people killed just for fun, without charging them with any crime. Later emperors continued to use the wheel against political opponents, slaves and members of the lower classes. It was a handy tool that required little effort. The ruler only needed to pronounce a sentence and then the executioner did the dirty work. For ordinary citizens, the wheel of pain was a source of great terror. It was a constant reminder that they could be next, so they gathered to watch executions in the public squares. For the condemned, it was a horrible way to die. First, they were paraded through the streets for everyone to see. Then they were stripped naked and tied to the wheel. Finally, they suffered excruciating pain while being rotated, twisted and broken until death finally came. Sometimes the wheel itself became a display of death. It was placed outside the city walls as a warning to everyone who dared oppose Rome. But the truth is that the wheel of pain doesn't hold a candle to the other ways to die in ancient Rome. For instance, have you heard of the Roman fork? It was used to impale criminals and then roast them over a fire. Watch our next video to find out more.